The morning Anthony Brooks arrived at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. The sky over Arlington was the color of old pewter, heavy with clouds that had not yet decided whether to rain or simply threaten. It was the kind of cold that did not announce itself dramatically. No wind, no drama, just a steady, penetrating chill that settled into the bones the moment you stepped outside. The kind of cold that veterans knew well. The kind that reminded you of other mornings in other places where the temperature was the least of your problems. Anthony had been awake since 4:30. Not because his flight required it, though arriving 3 hours early was the kind of habit that 26 years of military service had pressed permanently into the architecture of his daily life. He was awake because he had not slept well. He rarely did the night before anything that mattered, and tomorrow's ceremony, the National Veterans Recognition Ceremony at the Capitol, mattered enormously. Not for him, he kept reminding himself, for the men and women who would never attend anything again. He had packed carefully the night before, sitting on the edge of his bed in the small, clean apartment he kept in Woodbridge, laying each item out on the comforter before placing it into the worn canvas rucksack that had traveled more miles with him than any suitcase he had ever owned. There was a change of clothes, his dress shoes, wrapped in a cloth, a toiletry bag, his phone charger, and then, wrapped separately in a piece of soft gray flannel, the things that were not clothing or practical necessity but something else entirely. 3 photographs, a folded flag, pressed into a perfect triangle, and sealed inside a clear acrylic case, a campaign ribbon, 2 service medals, and a small battered notebook with a brown leather cover that he had carried through 2 deployments, the pages soft from handling, filled with names and notes and, in some places, nothing at all. Just blank space where words had failed him. He placed these inside the rucksack with the same deliberate care a person uses when handling something irreplaceable, which is exactly what they were. At the airport, he moved through the departures level without hurry. The terminal was not yet crowded. It was barely 6:15, but it had that particular early morning airport energy. A low hum of people moving with purpose through fluorescent light, dragging roller bags, clutching coffee cups, checking phones. Anthony did not have a roller bag. He did not have coffee yet, though he intended to get some after clearing security. He had his rucksack on one shoulder, his boarding pass on his phone, and the practiced ease of a man who had learned long ago that composure was not the absence of feeling, but its disciplined management. He found the security checkpoint and joined the line. There were perhaps 12 people ahead of him, spread across 2 lanes. He chose the lane on the right, shifted his rucksack to his other shoulder, and waited. He was dressed the way he always dressed when he was not in uniform, which had now been 7 years. A dark navy wool sweater, dark slacks, clean boots. Not expensive clothes. Good clothes. Kept well. He did not look like a man who had once held the highest non-commissioned rank in the United States Army. He looked like what he was. A 58-year-old black man waiting in line at an airport on a cold Wednesday morning in January. The line moved steadily. He removed his boots, placed his rucksack and his phone and his keys in the gray plastic bin, stepped through the millimeter wave scanner without incident. The machine was silent. He stepped out the other side and waited for his bin to come through the conveyor. It stopped. The screen at the X-ray station froze, and Officer Jason Reed, 29 years old and 7 months into this particular posting, leaned forward at his monitor and looked at something that made him press a button on his radio. Anthony watched the bin sit still on the belt. He had been through airport security many hundreds of times. He knew what a routine secondary inspection looked like, and he knew what this looked like, and he was not yet sure which one this was. He said nothing. He waited. Officer Karen Mills, the shift supervisor, came around from the secondary inspection area. She was 41, with close-cropped hair and a bearing that communicated authority efficiently. She looked at the screen Reed was pointing at, then looked at Anthony, then back at the screen. "Sir," she said, "we're going to need to take a closer look at your bag." "Of course," Anthony said. "Not a problem." They moved the bin to the secondary table. Mills put on a pair of blue nitrile gloves and unzipped the rucksack with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times, which she had. She began removing items, setting them on the stainless steel surface, the clothes, the shoes, the toiletry bag, and then the flannel-wrapped bundle. She paused at it, glanced at Anthony. "What's this?" "Military memorabilia," Anthony said. "Medals, photographs, a service flag. I'm traveling to a veterans ceremony in Washington." Mills said nothing. She unwrapped the flannel, the acrylic case with the folded flag, the photographs, the medals in their velvet-lined cases, the notebook. She picked up one of the medal cases, opened it, looked at the decoration inside. A soldier's medal, gold and blue and precisely machined. As if she were looking at something mildly puzzling found at the bottom of a junk drawer. "Can I ask where you got these?" Anthony felt the question land in a particular way. Not as a procedural inquiry, which would have been entirely reasonable, but as something with a different texture beneath it. He recognized that texture. He had spent 58 years learning to recognize it. "They were awarded to me," he said, "during my service." "Mm-hmm." She set the medal case down and picked up the notebook. "What's in here?" "Personal notes, nothing contraband. I'm going to need to look through it." Anthony paused for just a moment. "That's a private document." "Huh?" "Sir, for security purposes, we have the right to inspect all items." She was not wrong, technically. He knew that. And so he said, "Understood." And he stepped back slightly and clasped his hands in front of him, a posture that those who had served under him would have recognized immediately. The posture of a man exercising extraordinary restraint. Behind him, the line had shifted. People were noticing. Not obviously. The way people in public notice things they do not want to seem to be noticing. Glancing sideways, slowing their repacking, finding reasons to stay in the vicinity of the secondary table. A woman in a gray coat had her phone angled in his direction. He registered it without reacting. Reed, working quietly at the table beside Mills, had moved more quickly through the practical items, the shoes, the toiletry bag, and was now standing slightly apart, watching Mills work through the notebook with a look on his face that was not quite neutral. He did not say anything. Mills flipped through the notebook, looked at the pages, set it down, picked up one of the photographs, black and white, showing a younger Anthony in uniform with a group of soldiers, and studied it. "Is this you?" "Yes, ma'am." "Where was this taken?" "Forward Operating Base Salerno, Afghanistan, 2005. She looked at the photograph a moment longer than was strictly necessary, placed it face down on the table. Anthony watched her do it. He said nothing. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step over here while we complete the inspection." She gestured toward a small bench against the wall, a few feet away, separated from the main flow of the checkpoint by a low partition. Anthony looked at her. He looked at the bench. He looked back at her. "Am I being detained?" "This is a security inspection. It will only take a few more minutes." He nodded once. He walked to the bench. He sat down. He placed his hands on his knees, and he sat very still, and he breathed very evenly. And he looked straight ahead at the wall across from him where a poster described the TSA's commitment to the safety and dignity of all travelers. He read that poster slowly. He read it all the way through. Then he read it again. 7 minutes passed. A man in his 30s with a rolling suitcase caught Anthony's eye and held it for a moment, something sympathetic and uncomfortable in his expression, before looking away and continuing toward his gate. Mills came to the bench. "Sir, we're flagging a few of the items as requiring additional documentation." "What documentation?" "Verification of ownership for the military articles." Anthony looked at her. "They are service medals, awarded to me by the United States Army. There is no third-party documentation for that." "We're not trying to create a problem, sir." "Then what are you trying to do?" He said it quietly, without heat, without accusation in his voice, and that quiet was somehow louder than anger would have been. Mills held his gaze. Reed, standing 10 feet away, looked at the floor. The checkpoint hummed around them. Shoes went into bins, laptops came out of bags. Children were lifted through scanners. The ordinary machinery of transit continued its ordinary work, and in the middle of it, on a bench against a wall. A man who had served his country across 2 decades and 2 continents sat with his hands on his knees and waited for someone to decide whether his medals were real. It was 6:47 in the morning. His flight did not board for 2 more hours. Plenty of time. He reminded himself of that. Plenty of time. He had survived things that would have broken most people. He could survive this. He sat. He waited. He did not look away from the poster on the wall. Across the terminal, in the drop-off lane outside Terminal B, a black SUV with government plates pulled smoothly to the curb. The driver came around and opened the rear door, and General William Harrison stepped out into the January cold with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had long ago stopped experiencing weather as an inconvenience. He was 63 years old, tall, with silver, close-cropped hair, and a bearing that other military men recognized instantly, and that civilians registered as something compelling without always being able to name it. He wore civilian clothes, a charcoal overcoat over a dark suit, because 4-star generals attending national ceremonies did not always advertise themselves in transit, a habit Harrison had cultivated deliberately over a career that spanned 4 decades. He believed, with some intensity, that a leader who required visible markers of authority to command respect was not actually commanding it. Behind him came Major Daniel Okafor, his aide, 28 and meticulous, and Colonel Sarah Vance, his senior staff officer, who was already on her phone managing the logistics of whatever the next 12 hours required. "Terminal's clear," Okafor said quietly. "Good." Harrison adjusted his coat. "Let's go." They moved through the sliding doors into the departures level. Harrison did not use TSA pre-check, a fact that surprised people when they learned it. He was perfectly capable of arranging whatever expedited screening his rank entitled him to, and he almost never did. Some habits die hard. Others are not habits but principles, and Harrison had decided long ago that he would stand in the same lines as the people he had spent his career serving, because the moment you stopped doing that, something important in you began to calcify. They joined the security line at the main checkpoint. Harrison looked down the queue with the automatic situational awareness that never fully turned off, cataloging the space, the people, the points of movement and stillness. And then he stopped. Over the heads of the people in line ahead of him, through the gap between 2 inspection stations, he saw the secondary inspection area. He saw the bench. He saw the man sitting on it. For a moment he was entirely still, and Major Okafor, who had been at Harrison's side for 2 years and had learned to read the general stillness the way sailors read weather, looked immediately in the direction Harrison was looking. "Sir?" Okafor said. Harrison did not respond immediately. He was looking at the man on the bench, at the posture. Hands on knees, back straight, eyes forward, the perfect motionless discipline of someone who had learned to hold themselves together in worse conditions than this. And something in Harrison's chest did something that required a moment to absorb. He hadn't seen Anthony Brooks in 4 years. He had thought about him more recently than that. Anthony had been a command sergeant major under Harrison's command in 2005, when Harrison was a 2-star, and Anthony was the kind of non-commissioned officer that commanders prayed for and rarely deserved. Utterly reliable, ferociously competent, constitutionally incapable of leaving anyone behind. Harrison had watched him, over the course of 2 deployments, make decisions under pressure that Harrison had later described in private to people he trusted completely, as the finest examples of leadership under fire that he had personally witnessed in 35 years of service. Anthony had also, in Harrison's direct experience, never once complained, never asked for recognition he had not earned, never traded on his record, had separated from the Army 7 years ago with precisely the low profile that his entire character predicted, and had gone on, as far as Harrison knew, to live a quiet life and do quiet work and carry what he had carried. And Anthony had carried a great deal, with the same self-contained dignity that Harrison had always associated with the genuinely strong. He was sitting on a bench in the secondary inspection area of an airport at 6:50 in the morning, and Harrison could read from 30 feet away and through the general bustle of the checkpoint The particular quality of stillness that said, "I have been here longer than I should have been, and no one has explained why, and I am not going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me react." Harrison said to Okafor quietly, "Come with me." Okafor did not ask questions. Vance, still on her phone, looked up, clocked Harrison's direction, and began following without breaking her sentence. Harrison did not go around the checkpoint. He did not produce credentials or identify himself. He simply walked, directly and without hurry, to the entrance of the secondary inspection area. And a transportation security officer who started to move toward him read something in Harrison's face and thought better of whatever he had been about to say. Mills, at the inspection table, had her back to the approaching group. Reed saw them first, and his expression did something complicated. Harrison walked to the bench. Anthony heard footsteps approach and looked up. For a moment, neither man said anything. Then Harrison said, "Anthony!" Anthony's face, which had been held in careful neutrality for the last 23 minutes, did something. Not a dramatic change, a small one. The particular relaxation that happens in a person's face when someone they respect walks into a room. He started to rise. Harrison held up a hand briefly. "Don't get up on my account." "General," Anthony said. And then, because 26 years of conditioning did not disappear, he stood anyway. Harrison extended his hand. Anthony took it. Harrison gripped it firmly, covered it with his left hand for a moment, the double clasp that says more than most words. "What are you doing here?" Harrison said. "Heading to the ceremony, the Veterans Recognition event at the—" "Of course you are." Harrison looked at him carefully. "How long have you been sitting here?" A pause. 20-some minutes. Harrison's jaw was very still. He turned and looked at Officer Mills, who had turned around at some point during this exchange, and was now standing at the inspection table with an expression that was cycling through something complicated and not particularly comfortable. "Ma'am," Harrison said, "can you explain to me what's happening here?" Mills straightened. Whatever she had expected this morning, she was recalibrating in real time. "Sir, we were conducting a secondary inspection of this gentleman's belongings. For 20 minutes. There were questions about certain items in his baggage." "What items?" A pause. "Military memorabilia, medals, documentation." Harrison looked at the table. He looked at the medals in their open cases, the photographs laid out on the steel surface, the folded flag in its acrylic case. He looked at the photograph that had been placed face down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That medal right there. The soldier's medal. I know that decoration. I was the officer who recommended it." The checkpoint around them had grown quieter. Not silent. Airports are never silent. But the particular active listening quiet of a space where a number of people have simultaneously decided to hear something they might otherwise have ignored. Mills said nothing. "This man," Harrison said, and his voice was level and clear and carried the way voices carry when they are accustomed to being heard over things much louder than an airport checkpoint, served this country for 26 years. He was a command sergeant major. He led soldiers through 2 combat deployments. He received that decoration, he gestured at the soldier's medal, for pulling 3 people out of a burning vehicle under fire, which is to say, he ran towards something that most people on this planet would run away from, and he did it without hesitation, and he did it without being asked. He stopped. The checkpoint was very quiet. Okafor stood slightly behind and to Harrison's right. His face was composed. His eyes were not. Reed had put down what he was holding and was standing with his hands at his sides, looking at Anthony with an expression that had moved all the way past complicated into something nakedly uncomfortable. Harrison looked at Mills. Is there a reason this gentleman cannot collect his belongings and continue to his gate? Mills held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she looked at Anthony. "No, sir," she said. And she heard, as she said it, how inadequate those words were, and she said them anyway because there was nothing else to say. "No, there is not." She began carefully to return Anthony's belongings to his rucksack. Harrison watched her do it. He did not look away. When the folded flag in its acrylic case was returned to the bag, something in the watching crowd, passengers, staff, A pair of airline workers who had stopped near the rope line moved, and someone began to clap, not loudly, not theatrically, but with the kind of slow, deliberate clapping that gathers rather than explodes. And within a few seconds others had joined it. And the sound in that part of the terminal was the sound of people who had witnessed something they would not quickly forget. Anthony looked at the floor for a moment, looked up, looked at Harrison. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "No," Harrison said. "I know I didn't." They looked at each other in the particular way of people who have been through things together that only they fully understand. "Thank you," Anthony said. Harrison nodded once. "You've got a flight to catch." Anthony bent and picked up his rucksack, settled it on his shoulder, straightened. He looked at Mills and then at Reed, and his face held no anger, nothing punishing or triumphant, just a steadiness that was harder to meet than anger would have been. "I hope," he said quietly, "that the next person who comes through here with a bag full of memories gets treated a little better." He walked toward the gate. Harrison watched him go. Then he turned back to the checkpoint and to the people in it, and his expression was not satisfied or victorious. It was something more tired and more serious than either of those things. "All right," he said to Okafor. Okafor handed him his boarding pass. They proceeded through the checkpoint. Gate B-17 was a 40-minute wait from departure, and Anthony Brooks had exactly enough time. He found a seat near the window, one of the single chairs set slightly apart from the main seating cluster, and placed his rucksack between his feet and looked out at the tarmac. The sky beyond the glass had lightened marginally, the pewter gray gone to something almost silver, and the ground crews were moving around the planes with the purposeful efficiency of people who did this work in all weather and thought nothing of it. He was not thinking about the checkpoint, or rather, he was trying not to, and not entirely succeeding. 26 years. That was the number he kept returning to. Not as self-pity. He had no patience for that. Never had. But as a kind of arithmetic. 26 years of service, of sacrifice, of watching people he cared about come home changed, or not come home at all, of standing in the kinds of situations that press a person down to whatever they are made of at the core, and holding together, and leading, and never, not once in all those years, asking for credit for any of it. He had made peace with a great many things in the 7 years since he hung up his uniform. He had not made peace with everything. The checkpoint that morning had not surprised him. That was perhaps the most honest thing he could say about it. He had walked into spaces like that one. Stores, offices, government buildings, parking garages, airports, his entire adult life, and had been processed through them with that particular friction that white Americans sometimes did not notice, and black Americans almost never forgot. He knew the look. He knew the particular quality of attention that was not quite professional, not quite neutral, not quite what it claimed to be. He had learned, very young, that the most efficient response was also the most difficult. To be so clearly, patiently, unassailably composed that no one could reasonably accuse him of anything, while also knowing that his composure would probably be held against him one way or another. Too calm, too stiff, too something. 23 minutes on that bench. He had counted them. Old habit. He exhaled slowly through his nose and looked at his hands. A coffee cup appeared in his peripheral vision, held out from the seat beside him, and he turned. General Harrison. He was settled into the adjacent seat with the low-key economy of movement that people develop when they spend decades traveling for work. He held out a paper cup. "Black," he said. "I guessed." Anthony looked at him for a moment, then took the cup. "Thank you. I'm on the same flight." Harrison settled back, his own cup in hand. "Didn't know you were going to the ceremony." "Huh? Didn't know you would be either." "I don't advertise my schedule unnecessarily." "Neither do I." They sat for a moment in the comfortable silence of people who had occupied close quarters under duress and had learned to coexist in each other's quiet without filling it compulsively. "How are you doing?" Harrison said, not as a pleasantry, as an actual question, which Anthony noted. "Fine. Better than some days." "You retired, what? 7 years ago now?" 7 years in March? And you're good? Health-wise, everything? Anthony considered the question with the same care he gave to most things. Knees are not what they were. Sleep's not always great. Otherwise, I'm functional. Harrison nodded as though this translated into something specific for him, which it probably did. I see that report you filed on the incident at the checkpoint. Anthony looked at him. The report went through already? I made a call. A pause. I hope that's all right. What kind of call? The kind that makes sure what happened this morning is documented and reviewed. Not by me. That's not my lane anymore, technically. But by the appropriate parties. TSA has a process for... General. Anthony kept his voice level. I've been through this kind of process before. Harrison held his gaze. I know you have. Another pause. I'm not trying to make it bigger than it was, Anthony said. I don't need it to be a cause. I'm not interested in being on the news. Donna, that's not what this is. Then what is it? Harrison thought about this carefully. It's accountability, not theater. The difference matters. Anthony looked out the window again. A ground crew member was directing a luggage cart with a yellow handheld radio, steam rising faintly from the coffee in the driver's cup. The whole scene very ordinary and very quiet. I know what accountability looks like, Anthony said. I ran accountability hearings for 15 years. I know what it looks like when it works and what it looks like when it's optics. So do I. A beat. That's why I made the call I made. Anthony studied him for a moment. Harrison was not a man who said things he did not mean. This was one of the first things Anthony had learned about him years ago, in conditions where the cost of a man saying things he did not mean could be measured in lives. He had meant what he said at the checkpoint. He would mean what he was saying now. All right, Anthony said. All right, Harrison echoed. They drank their coffee. Around them, the gate filled gradually. Business travelers with laptops, families in puffy coats, a group of older veterans with branch pins on their caps who nodded at Anthony when they passed. The recognition between military men that needs no introduction. One of them, a man in his late 60s with the particular weathered look of someone who had spent significant time in desert climates, paused by their row. His eyes went from Anthony to Harrison and back. You two headed to the ceremony? He asked. We are, Harrison said. The man nodded slowly, extended his hand to Anthony first, then to Harrison. Sergeant First Class Thomas Adeyemi, retired, 10th Mountain Division. Anthony Brooks, CSM, retired. He returned the handshake. Good to meet you. Bill Harrison, said Harrison, which made Adeyemi blink once, before his expression rearranged itself. General Harrison? Just Harrison today. Adeyemi looked at him for a moment, then at Anthony, then back at Harrison, and whatever he read in the combination of the two men and the morning and the gate and the coffee cups made him give a short nod that encompassed a great deal. All right, he said. Good men. He moved on to find his seat. Anthony watched him go. What you said at the checkpoint, Anthony said after a moment. About the vehicle, the 3 people. Harrison waited. You didn't have to tell them that. No, Harrison said. But it was true. There are a lot of things that are true that don't need to be said. Also true. Harrison looked at him. But this was something I wanted said. That's different. Anthony was quiet for a moment. Rivera, he said. And Harrison knew immediately what he meant. Garrett. And the interpreter. Ibrahim. I know. I don't talk about it much. I know that too. A pause. They're all still alive, Anthony. Something moved in Anthony's face. He looked down at his coffee cup for a moment, then back up and out the window. I know, he said. His voice was steady. Ibrahim has a daughter now, Harrison said. She's 4. He sends me a photo every Christmas. A pause. I'll forward you the last one if you want it. Anthony sat with that for a long moment. The gate announcement played overhead. Something about boarding group order, something about overhead bin space, the ordinary logistics of an ordinary flight on an ordinary winter morning. Yeah, Anthony said finally. I'd like that. They boarded without ceremony and settled into adjacent seats in the middle cabin. Harrison's aide and staff officer taking seats a row behind, giving the 2 men the particular privacy of a short flight and a conversation that was not quite finished. The plane pushed back from the gate at 8:22 on schedule, and Anthony watched the terminal building slide past the window and then recede, and the airfield opened up around them, the runways and taxiways and the low winter sky, and the sense of momentum, of leaving something, was a feeling he still, after all the flights of his military career, found unexpectedly relieving. They were in the air for 32 minutes. In that time, without intending to, they spoke about things they had not spoken about before. It began with the ceremony, Harrison describing the program, who was speaking, what the commemorative elements would be, and then moved, as conversations between men with long shared histories sometimes do, backward and sideways into the past. "Do you think about it?" Harrison asked, somewhere over the Potomac. "The deployments." Anthony looked at him. "Constantly." "What part?" "All of it." A pause. "Different parts at different hours. There are days when it's the good things, the work, the people, the mornings when everything was clear and the mission was clean and you knew exactly what needed doing and you did it. And then there are other hours." Harrison nodded. "I don't sleep great," Anthony said. "I said functional earlier. That's the professional answer. The honest answer is that I'm doing better than I was 3 years ago. And 3 years ago I was doing better than I was at year 1. So the trend is correct." "Are you talking to anyone?" "A VA counselor. Twice a month." A pause. "I resisted it for a long time, which is the stupidest thing I've ever done. And I've done some genuinely stupid things under fire." Harrison almost smiled. "How long did it take you?" 4 years. "It took me 3. A beat. After the second deployment." Anthony looked at him. "I don't advertise that either," Harrison said. "But it's true. 4 stars does not mean impervious." "No," Anthony said. "It doesn't." They flew in silence for a moment, the plane banking slightly east, the gray sprawl of the Capitol coming into view below them, the monuments and the river and the white dome of the Capitol standing against the winter sky. "Can I ask you something?" Anthony said. "You can ask. Why did you come over to the checkpoint this morning?" "Not rhetorically. I know what you did, and I'm grateful for it. But specifically, why? You could have kept walking." Harrison was quiet for a moment. "Could I?" "Practically speaking." "Practically speaking." Harrison turned the phrase over. "I don't know how to answer that practically. I saw you on that bench, and I knew what was happening, and I knew who you were, and I—" He stopped. Started again. "I've spent 40 years making decisions about when to act and when not to act. Some of those decisions I'm proud of. Some I'm not." A pause. "This one did not require deliberation." Anthony absorbed that. "You're going to make a speech tomorrow," Anthony said. "I am." "What are you going to say?" Harrison looked out the window. The Capitol was receding now, the plane descending toward Reagan National on its approach. "I'm going to say that service is not something that ends when the uniform comes off, that the obligation we have to the people who served runs beyond the ceremonies and the speeches, that respecting someone's dignity doesn't require knowing their rank or their record. It just requires treating them like a person, which is, of course, the easiest thing in the world, and apparently also the most difficult." Anthony said nothing for a moment. "That's a good speech," he said. "I've been working on it for a month. You just made it better." The plane touched down smoothly at 8:55. They were the last 2 off. The National Veterans Recognition Ceremony was held in the Russell Senate Office building, a block from the Capitol, in one of the grand old caucus rooms with high ceilings and marble floors, and the particular institutional gravity of a space that had hosted important things for many decades. The room filled quickly. Veterans and active military, congressional staffers, family members, journalists, and by 9:40 there was standing room only at the back, the air warm with bodies and the low sound of several hundred conversations. Anthony sat in the 3rd row, in a seat that had been reserved for him. Someone had apparently arranged this, and he suspected he knew who, but said nothing about it. And he watched the room fill with the kind of people that rooms like this are supposed to fill with. Old men with branch pins and younger men without pins who carried themselves in the way that said they had earned them recently. Women in dress blues. families with children who looked at the flags and the decorations with wide-eyed seriousness. A congressional delegation that took their seats with the professional ease of people accustomed to occasions. The ceremony opened with a color guard and a national anthem that the room sang with the unperformed sincerity of people for whom the words meant something specific. Anthony sang quietly, not reading the words. He had not needed to read those words in 35 years. The first speaker was a senator from Georgia who spoke well and genuinely about sacrifice and obligation. The second was a representative of the Department of Veterans Affairs who spoke about programs and access and the ongoing work of care. And the room listened with the particular attentiveness of people who knew the gap between rhetoric and reality, but appreciated the effort. And then General Harrison walked to the podium. The room settled in the way that rooms settle when they sense that something is about to matter. He stood for a moment, just looking at the room. This was something Anthony had seen him do before speaking, in very different contexts. The deliberate pause that was not for effect but for himself. A gathering in, a brief moment of quiet before the words. "I've been preparing remarks for today for about a month," Harrison said. His voice was clear and unhurried, carrying easily in the marble room. "I was going to talk about the formal history of the recognition we're honoring today, the legislative record, the meaning of continuity in service, all of it real, all of it important." A pause. And then something happened this morning that made me set those remarks aside. The room was very still. "A few rows in front of me," Harrison said, "there's a man I served with in two of the most difficult operational environments I've ever been in. A man who led soldiers through conditions that I am not going to describe in detail this morning, except to say that the quality of leadership I watched him exercise, under fire, under extreme uncertainty, with the lives of people he was responsible for depending on decisions he had to make in seconds, set a standard that I have used as a reference point in my own work for the last 20 years. Anthony did not move. He was aware of people looking at him. He did not look back. "This morning," Harrison said, "before this ceremony, this man was detained at an airport security checkpoint for 23 minutes. His belongings were removed and spread on a steel table. His medals were examined as though their legitimacy was in question. His military photographs were handled without care. He was asked to sit on a bench and wait while other travelers passed through without incident. And through all of it, he did not raise his voice. He did not demand special treatment. He simply waited with the discipline and composure that 26 years of service had built into him." A pause. And that discipline and composure, as it happens, is exactly the reason the situation was allowed to go on as long as it did. The room was absolutely silent now. I am not telling this story to embarrass anyone. I am not telling it to score points. I am telling it because it illustrates, with complete precision, something I believe we need to talk about more honestly than we usually do, which is that respect, real respect, not ceremonial respect, not the kind that shows up on days like today in rooms like this, has to be practiced every day, in every interaction, between every person. It cannot be conditional on what someone is wearing. It cannot be contingent on visible markers of status. It has to be the default. Because the alternative is a world where a man who spent 26 years serving this country gets treated like a suspect in the airport. He stopped. He looked at Anthony. "Sergeant Major Brooks," he said, "would you stand?" Anthony sat very still for a moment. Then he stood. The room stood with him. Stood. Not all at once. It moved in a wave, the way genuine responses do, not the orchestrated rising of formal ceremony, but the spontaneous standing of people who feel something and express it the only way immediately available. The applause lasted for close to a minute. Anthony kept his eyes forward. His hands were at his sides. His jaw was set. He was thinking about Rivera and Garrett, and a man named Ibrahim who had a 4-year-old daughter and sent photographs at Christmas. He was thinking about all the people in that room who had their own versions of what he had carried, their own weight, their own mornings. He was thinking that he had not wanted to be here, in this particular way, standing up and being looked at, that this was not what he had come for, that he had come to honor, not to be honored, and that those were different things and the difference mattered to him. But he stood. Because Harrison had asked him to, and because Harrison did not ask for things without reason. When the room settled, he sat back down. The man beside him, a retired Navy chief petty officer he had never met before today, reached over and gripped his arm briefly, without a word, and then released it, and Anthony nodded once without looking at him, and that exchange was complete. The afternoon after the ceremony was a different kind of time. The formal schedule broke into a reception, white tablecloths, coffee and water, and catered food that everyone took politely and ate sparingly. The particular social metabolism of large gatherings where the substance has already occurred, and what remains is the aftermath. Anthony moved through it with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to institutions, shaking hands, accepting gratitude with the controlled discomfort of someone who found receiving attention harder than most people found generating it. He spoke with a retired Marine colonel who ran a veterans employment placement nonprofit in Philadelphia and who had ideas about what they both knew regarding the administrative labyrinth that separated service members from functional civilian careers. He spoke with a woman named Dr. Patricia Nguyen, a psychologist who worked exclusively with veterans transitioning out of service, who had the efficient warmth of someone accustomed to making connections with people who distrusted connection. He spoke with several members of the congressional delegation who had kind things to say that he accepted without elaboration. At 3 p.m, Harrison found him near a window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. "There are some people I'd like you to meet," Harrison said. "More people?" "Last ones, I promise." The people were 3 TSA oversight officials who had, it emerged, been in contact with the regional TSA administrator since early morning. There had been a report filed. There had been a review initiated. The officials were professional and careful in their language, the language of institutional accountability, which Anthony had spoken fluently for decades, and which had its own kind of lexicon, its own careful grammar. He listened to them. He answered their questions directly. He did not perform outrage, and he did not perform forgiveness. He had learned, over many years and in many different institutional contexts, that the performance of either emotion in bureaucratic settings was less useful than the precise articulation of what had happened and what should happen differently. What he told them was this: he had cooperated fully at every stage. He had answered every question. He had not been combative or uncooperative or difficult in any identifiable way, and he had nonetheless been held for 23 minutes and subjected to an inspection that, in his observation and in his experience of over 100 airport security interactions in his post-military life, exceeded by a significant margin what was operationally necessary. He did not know why. He had a reasonable inference about why. He would not state that inference as fact, but he expected them to investigate it with the rigor they would apply to any procedural irregularity. They nodded. They wrote things. One of them, a woman in her 40s with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of directness that Anthony instinctively respected, said, "We're conducting a full review of the checkpoint procedures and supervisor conduct for this morning's shift. I want you to know that is not window dressing." Anthony looked at her. "I'll know whether it was in about 6 months, when I see what changed." She held his gaze. "Fair enough." He shook their hands and moved back toward the window. Harrison fell in beside him. "Thank you," Anthony said, "for making that happen. It should have happened without me making it happen." "Yes," Anthony said, "it should have." A pause. "But it didn't, so thank you." Harrison accepted this. They stood at the window for a moment. Outside, the January afternoon was darkening early, the way January afternoons do, the Capitol dome illuminated now against a sky that had moved from silver to deep blue. "What are you doing after this?" Harrison asked. "Going home? Tonight? Tomorrow morning." He paused. "I'm staying at a hotel near the mall. Walk around a little tonight. I like the mall in winter. Nobody else does, which means it's actually quiet." Harrison was quiet for a moment. "I'll be at the Vietnam Memorial at around 6, if you want company." Anthony looked at him. "You're going to the memorial tonight?" "I go every time I'm in the city. Have for 20 years. Anthony knew that Harrison had served one tour in the late stages of the Gulf War, had not been in Vietnam himself, and visited the memorial out of something that had nothing to do with personal loss in the way most people meant it, and everything to do with what it meant to be a person who sent people into danger. "Yes," Anthony said. "I'll be there." The mall in January at 6 in the evening is a different country than the mall in summer. The tourists are gone, or most of them. The wide gravel paths are empty, except for the occasional jogger, breath coming in puffs in the cold air. And the reflecting pools have a stillness that the summer crowds never allow. The monuments glow against the dark sky, Lincoln white and enormous at the west end, the Washington Monument a lit needle to the north, and the whole long sweep of it, the grass and the gravel and the cold, has the quality of a very large and very quiet room. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial is tucked into the northwest corner of the mall, below the tree line, and even in summer it has a different quality than the other monuments, lower, darker, less monumental in the traditional sense. The long black granite wall inscribed with names descending into the earth and then rising again. The design, a deliberate refusal of triumph. Anthony arrived at 5:55. Harrison was already there, standing at the point where the wall begins its descent, his hands in the pockets of his overcoat, his breath visible in the cold air. He turned when he heard footsteps. They stood side by side for a moment, looking at the wall. The names were hard to read in the low light. There were lights embedded in the path, but they were subtle, and Anthony had to lean slightly forward to make out specific letters. He found the name he always looked for. It took him about 40 seconds, which was faster than the first time and slower than it should have been, because the wall was long and the names were many, and each one represented the permanent subtraction of a particular human being from the world. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, 11th Airborne Division, killed in action, 1969. Anthony had never met Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb had died 6 years before Anthony was born. Marcus Webb was Anthony's mother's brother, which meant that Anthony had grown up with his photograph on the mantel above the fireplace in the house in Baltimore where he was raised. A young man in uniform looking at the camera with the particular expression of a soldier who has not yet gone where he is going. Anthony had joined the army, in part, because of that photograph. He had never told this to anyone who did not need to know it. He stood at the wall. After a while, Harrison said quietly, "Do you want to talk? Or just stand here?" "Just stand here," Anthony said. They stood. The cold settled around them. A couple walked past on the path above, talking quietly, and the sound of their voices faded. An aircraft moved silently across the sky overhead, lights blinking. Anthony thought about what it meant to be standing here, tonight, after the morning he had had. He thought about the bench in the airport, and the poster on the wall, and the 23 minutes and the way Mills had placed the photograph face down on the steel table. He thought about the ceremony and the standing and the applause, and the way the retired Navy chief beside him had gripped his arm without saying anything. He thought about service, what it was, what it cost, what it was supposed to mean, and what it actually meant, and the distance between those two things, which was sometimes very small and sometimes very large, and which he had spent most of his adult life trying to close. He thought about the 4-year-old daughter of a man named Ibrahim, who had survived something he had survived too, and how that fact, a child existing in the world who might not have existed, was the kind of arithmetic that made the cost make sense on the days when sense was available to be made. He placed his right hand flat against the wall, just below Marcus Webb's name. He stayed like that for a moment. Then he took his hand down and put it back in his pocket. "All right," he said. Harrison nodded. They walked back toward the mall in the cold dark, their footsteps quiet on the gravel, the monuments lit above them. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Anthony said. "Tell me." Officer Reed, the younger one? He paused. He knew something was wrong. You could see it. He just didn't say anything. Harrison walked a few steps before responding. "That's a very old problem." "It is." A pause. But he was 29 years old and new in his job, and his supervisor was doing something questionable, and he stood there and said nothing. "And I understand that. I've been in that position. Everyone has." He paused again. What I keep thinking is, someone needs to talk to him, not to discipline him, to tell him that the moment he hesitates to speak up when something is wrong is the moment it costs him something, because it always costs you something. Either you say something and it's uncomfortable, or you don't say something and you carry it. Harrison was quiet. Because I guarantee you he's carrying it right now, Anthony said. They walked. You know what you just described? Harrison said. What? Everything I tried to teach for 30 years. Anthony was quiet for a moment. How often does it work? He asked. Often enough, Harrison said. Not often enough. A long pause. No, Anthony said. Not often enough. 6 days later, Anthony Brooks sat in a folding chair in the gymnasium of James Madison High School in Woodbridge, Virginia, watching a group of 17-year-olds attempt to take him apart. This was not metaphorical. He taught a civic education seminar at the school twice a month, had been doing it for 3 years, unpaid, by arrangement with a vice principal named Loretta Jacobs, who had cold emailed him after seeing a local news piece about his work with a veterans transition organization. And the students in the seminar had heard, through the particular velocity of social media, a version of what had happened at the airport. It had been 6 days. The version they had heard was not inaccurate in its broad strokes, and considerably more dramatic in its details than the actual events warranted, and they wanted to talk about it. He had let them talk. He had listened to 20 minutes of their reactions: anger, solidarity, the particular incandescent outrage of young people encountering a specific instance of a systemic problem they have been told does not exist, or does not exist anymore, or is being addressed. And then he had held up a hand. All right, he said. Let me ask you something. Every one of you. They settled. What would you have done? He looked around the room. You're standing in that line. You see a man, a 60-year-old black man, sitting on a bench while his belongings are spread out on a table, and his photographs are being handled, and he's being asked to wait. What do you do? Silence. Then a girl in the second row, Destiny Okafor, 17, who Anthony had come to identify as the student who would eventually say the thing no one else was ready to say, raised her hand. Record it, she said. Some people did record it, Anthony said. Then what? A pause. A boy in the back. Post it? Post it where? To what end? And then what? More silence. Richer this time. The silence of people actually thinking rather than waiting. The problem, Anthony said, is not that nobody did anything. Some people did things. Someone recorded it. Someone applauded when the general arrived. Those things were not nothing. He leaned forward slightly. The problem is timing. The moment of maximum impact is not after. It's during. And during is very uncomfortable, because during requires you to do something in public, in real time, without knowing how it will end. A boy in the middle row, Marcus Chen, the student who most often sat with his arms crossed, but whose questions were consistently the sharpest in the room, said, "But what can a random person in an airport actually do?" Good question, Anthony said. Exactly the right question. What can you do? He paused. You can approach a TSA supervisor and say, that man has been there for 20 minutes and I'm concerned. You can ask the person sitting on the bench if they need any help. You can find an airport employee, not security, just an employee, and say, I think something might be going wrong over there. Can someone check? You don't need to know the law. You don't need to have a plan. You need to say out loud to someone with more authority than you, I see this, and I think it's wrong. He looked at Destiny. You said record it. That's useful. But recording it and staying silent while you record it is a form of observation. I'm asking about participation. She met his eyes. What if they don't listen? Sometimes they don't. That's a real answer. Sometimes you say something and nothing changes in that moment. But you said it and someone heard it, and someone knows there's a witness. That changes the calculation for the person doing the wrong thing. He paused. And it changes the calculation for the person on the bench. The room was very still. Because when I was sitting on that bench, he said, I was not in danger. I was not in distress. I had been in much worse places. But I want to be honest with you about something. He looked at them. It matters when someone sees you. Not in a sentimental way, in a real way. It matters when a person looks at a situation that is unjust, even quietly, incrementally unjust, not dramatically unjust, just the low-level friction of being treated as less than, and decides that their discomfort at speaking up is less important than your dignity. That is a choice. It requires something. And it is a choice that more people could make more often than they do. Marcus Chen had uncrossed his arms. He was leaning forward. "You were in the army for 26 years, he said. Isn't it, he searched for the word. Doesn't it make you angry that after all that you still have to deal with this? Anthony looked at him for a long time. Yes, he said. Straightforward. No qualification, no buffer. Yes, it makes me angry. And I am going to tell you something important about that anger, which is that it is legitimate. And I do not try to talk myself out of it because it is a response to something real. What I do with it, that's the question. I can let it make me bitter, which serves no one. I can let it make me invisible, which is what it sometimes wants to do. Make you just pull back from the world and stop believing it can be different. Or I can do this. He gestured around the gymnasium. I can sit in this room twice a month and have this conversation, which is an argument that it can be different. That you, all of you, can make it different. Not because you're exceptional, because you're paying attention. He leaned back. That's all it requires at the beginning, he said. Just paying attention. And then the next thing. And the next thing after that. Destiny's hand went up again. What happened to the officer? The one who... That's in a review process, Anthony said, which I will follow and evaluate, and depending on what it produces, speak about or not. I trust the process to the degree that I have evidence for trusting it. Not more, and not less. That's very... She searched for the word. Measured, he offered. I was going to say controlled. Both are accurate. She looked at him with the particular expression of a 17-year-old who has just encountered a contradiction they cannot immediately resolve. An adult who is both angry and measured, both hurt and functioning, who holds two things at once that seem like they should cancel each other out. How do you do that? She said. Just hold all of that. Anthony thought about it. Practice, he said, and the knowledge that the alternative is worse. A pause. And good people. That helps more than anything. The last thing he did before leaving the school that day was stop in Vice Principal Loretta Jacobs' office, which had a motivational poster on the wall that he had been reading for 3 years, and which he was still not sure whether he found inspiring or exhausting, and tell her that he wanted to add a 3rd session per month. We need the room, she said. I know. Ask me to fundraise for the room. She looked at him over her reading glasses. I'll write the email tonight. Good. He walked out to the parking lot. The January cold had settled in for the evening, stars visible now above the suburban sprawl of Woodbridge, the kind of sky you got when the clouds finally cleared and the cold became clean. He sat in his car for a moment before starting it, his hands on the wheel. He was thinking about the photograph Harrison had forwarded to his phone that morning. A little girl, 4 years old, sitting in front of a birthday cake in a sunny kitchen somewhere, caught in the moment just before she leaned forward to blow out the candles. Her expression was the universal expression of children at that moment. Focused, delighted, absolutely present in the specific joy of the singular second. Her name, according to the caption Ibrahim had included, was Nadia. Anthony sat with that for a moment. Then he started the car and pulled out of the parking lot and drove home through the cold dark, and the stars were out, and the road was clear, and ahead of him the lights of Woodbridge arranged themselves in the ordinary pattern of an ordinary evening in a country that was, like all countries, both more and less than it claimed to be, and that was because of the people in it who paid attention and spoke up and kept showing up, still, unmistakably, worth working for. He drove. The heater hummed. The stars kept their positions, and somewhere in a sunny kitchen, a 4-year-old girl named Nadia was about to blow out her candles.